Hello, and welcome to the Moronomics podcast.
I'm Heather, the economist.
And I'm Joe, the moron. In this podcast, an accomplished, brilliant economist attempts to explain concepts from her field to her high school classmate, who's kind of a moron. Heather, for our lightning round, it's not immediately relevant to today's topic, but I was wondering if an economist wanted to travel to the most economically interesting place, and however you want to define interesting, what would be the most economically interesting place in your opinion? Not every economist,
Mm.
obviously, but for an esteemed economist such as yourself, what would you think of as the most economically interesting place?
Yeah, that's such a good one. Okay, I'll say a couple that just flashed in my head. I'm not sure which one's the best, but people have found places like that Burning Man conference surprisingly interesting because there's no money and everybody comes to the desert and they're all basically bartering and having to trade and find a sign of value, whether it's to a hamburger that's badly cooked or to somebody who brought a trailer out and is willing to have other people sleep there. So I think that's particularly places like that that operate without money or with sort of weird types of are kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of interest in the finance community and some of the countries that basically have gotten rid of their currency and either adopted more of a cryptocurrency like El Salvador, or it's always fascinating to go to Argentina and everybody wants to be paid in dollars and not Argentine pesos generally. So places, or I've traveled. I actually have it on my desk to nerd out here for a minute to Zimbabwe. Which had this is a special. Oh, this is so many zeros. $50 billion note that I bought for a quarter on the street.
Wow.
And so I think places like that are just in extremes of anything. And I think
Right.
for economics, those types of extremes are actually really interesting. And then obviously China is always remains such a fascinating place. Probably
Right.
China and Sweden get talked about the most other than the United States in economics just because of
Really?
their really unique conditions.
Huh. An interesting thing I heard about Sweden, and this may be a little far afield, but I heard someone saying that when you're like when you're a kid and you go to your friend's house, when it gets to be around dinner time, they'll either like send you home, rather like, you know, here we're more likely to, like, yeah, stay for dinner. They'll either send you home or you'll sit at the table with them, but they won't give you food. And
That's
it's because of that kind of scarcity mindset.
uh,
Obviously in a place like Sweden, you can't grow a ton of food all year. So, but yeah, so that is my factoid. I had no idea, by the way, that Argentina, they prefer being paid in dollars. I also would never have expected you to say Burning Man. Um,
no, I know it's definitely not a Heather place. I
yeah,
never been myself, but I think
yeah, no,
there's weird
it's
dynamics.
well, and I was thinking it's also, I mean, it's the bartering thing. It's also kind of encapsulated. It's like a bottle, that this economy happens in. 'Cause it's way out in the middle of nowhere, as I understand it. So that does make it kind of doubly interesting. It's not just that people do. It's not just that they're doing the bartering. It's that they have to, like
Hmm.
that you can't just kind of go over a couple of blocks and
No
and go to a
Starbucks or
regular
7-Eleven
store.
there. So yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway, okay, so uh, far afield again from our today's topic, which is birth rates, low birth rates. Why aren't people having kids? I guess is the more colloquial way to say it. And this is a topic we both have kind of personal connections to. So what are the birth rates, and when did they start to change big time? And I guess most interesting question, why did that happen? Uh, Please teach me.
yeah, no, I mean, there's been so many debates and headlines about this lately. It's a topic I've written about and thought a lot about myself. And anyway, look, I think most people know the numbers that traditionally you need 2.1 babies born per woman of reproductive age in order to keep your population about the same.
Okay.
Obviously, you need more than that to grow it. But
I'll
so
admit I
many.
didn't know that. So if anyone in the audience didn't know 2.1 per woman, you're in good company, or perhaps bad company with the moron. But please go on. Sorry.
No, and, obviously, a lot of nations have fallen below that and quite significantly below that in the past, sort of 20 years. The one of the lowest right now is South Korea. Depends what year you're looking at, but they're at point 0.7, so they've fallen below 1 per woman, and which basically means if 0.72, it basically means that for the millennials in South Korea today, for every 100 millennials in South Korea, there will only be 13 grandchildren for every 100 millennials, which is just, that really helps you think through how quickly the population can shrink. In the United States, the UK is down to 1.4. There's a lot of European countries that are in that 1.3 to 1.5 range. And then the United States, again, it fluctuates a little bit year to year, but is at 1.6. So there's a couple of countries, some of them, I think Norway. Let's see, I used to know this. Germany, the US, uh, s- uh, France, they're kind of hovering in the 1.6 to 1.8 range, depending upon what year you're looking at. Yeah. So
Within
anyway,
sort of
you can,
the
so
the
it's a,
Western,
yeah,
sorry,
it's
within the
not,
Western world, it's in that ballpark. I gotcha. Okay.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. The two key questions that have fascinated really the general population and politicians, but especially economists, are why is it happening? Why has there been this dramatic almost everywhere in the world? The one exception is Africa, now the youngest continent, you know. But most other parts of the world are in this situation, and some quite extreme, like South Korea and Japan, and others right behind them. And then also the question and a lot of debate among economists, is this something that should keep us up at night? Like, are we essentially going out of existence because we're not reproducing? So both economic consequences and sort of social and societal consequences. So anyway, I'm really excited to talk about this with you. If we give a little bit of our backgrounds, I live in this weird world where the media and pop culture keep talking about nobody's having any kids, and yet I am a single mom by choice. So I have one daughter that I had by ordering sperm online, felt almost like Amazon. We have met a number of my daughter's half siblings by now, but it's been a very positive experience. But I hear from women, mainly women, some men, almost every week who are so desperate to have children. Maybe they didn't find a partner or things broke up or whatever, life got in the way. And now they're 35 to 45 and they are desperately trying to have kids. So I hear that echo chamber while so many people are talking about nobody wants kids, I'm hearing all these people who are desperate to have kids. They're turning, to IVF, or adoption, or, in the case of men who want to do it, to surrogacy. So that's an interesting perspective that I bring to this dialogue, and I know you also have an interesting viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, so I had always thought of it as something I was just gonna do someday. And I remember it was actually not quite. It was a little earlier than this time of year. The first year my wife and I were living together before we had actually gotten married. Sorry, God. Um, but we were at the laundromat. We were dead broke. She was in graduate school. I was kind of half employed, and we were just like we weren't poor, but we were definitely broke. Rich in love though. And we were at the laundromat, and at the time I was still trying to finish up my dissertation and my PhD, and there were these kids just running around the laundromat, and I was kind of doing that thing where you tally through all of your hardships and stuff like that, and I said, and we got to start saving up money if we're ever gonna have kids. And then at that moment, she and I are kind of sitting there, and we both were like, we don't actually have to have kids, do we? And I was like, "No, we really don't have to." And I'd always thought of it as just, well, it's what you do. That's the next step. We're planning our wedding and thinking, "Oh, yeah, that'll be the next thing." And it had just never occurred to me. I was always kind of the youngest,
Mhm.
of so I was the younger sibling in our household, and in our my family's friends circles and extended family circles, I was always the baby. So to me, it was always interact with older people. And so I never really got good with kids, which is funny because I ended up working in education for a while. But so I never really did want them. Like I would have never said explicitly that I wanted them. And so once I realized I didn't have to, it was this burden lifted from me. And I haven't really regretted that. And my wife feels very much, obviously, she feels the same way. Um, as she's like, yeah, we don't really want them. I think it's people say, why don't you? I would say, why do you want them? And people will name different things, different reasons and stuff like that. But fundamentally, it's a thing you do because you want to. And I think
Yeah.
in much the same way, for us at least, our decision was it was a thing we didn't do because we didn't want to. So that's kind of my connection to it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and what you're describing is called in the economics world shifting priorities.
Mm,
And that can encompass a whole range of things, the shifting priorities. Some of it is there's obviously so many more opportunities for women. And so they're prioritizing careers. I think a lot of people are prioritizing travel or just more personal time and personal growth. And look, as the mom of a almost 4-year old, it's tough. Mean, I remember having this debate with a former colleague. Like, if you made a pro con list of why to have kids, there are so many cons. And they're right. The one pro is, but I really want a kid, and it's like life fulfilling. And you really have to remind yourself of that some days are very, very hard and grueling.
yeah.
And I'll just echo what you were saying, that something that really stood out to me is obviously speak to a lot of friends who are in their 40s now or 50s, and somebody who's just turned 50 told me, you know, 15 to 20 years ago, people would always, when I would say, I don't want to have kids, they would say, you will someday, just like you're thinking, or it'll happen, or, just keep trying, these sorts of optimistic. And she's like, now, and then I'm 50. Obviously, she hasn't had kids. And so, but so many people, their reaction now is, you were smart. It's not even the, like, "I'm sorry," or "It'll happen." It's like, "Wow, you were smart." And that's how much society has shifted, and the shifting priorities, and across the world. It's not just an American phenomenon, and I've even pointed out that on television programs, you think about, I don't know about you, but, like, what I grew up watching in the 80s and 90s, like TGIF, it was all these Family Matters, shows, Steve
Full
Urkel,
House,
Full
Family
House,
Matters,
yes.
Step
Uh-huh.
by Step. Yep,
Yes.
I almost
Yes.
remember the whole lineup. That's so
Right.
funny.
Right. I mean, it was, most shows were about families. I mean, it was humor, right? And it could be different types of families, but it was very much family humor. And now it really started to change in the late 90s, early 2000s. These shows about whether it's things like Sex in the City, 90210, either about young people or working people or about ER or whatever. And it was so much less about family, and it was about your job, your personal fulfillment. You could see the shift just happening in real time.
I was gonna say workplace, particularly like the sitcom has been kind of replaced by the workplace comedy. I'd never thought about that, but now that you say it, yeah, what are our top comedies? 30 Rock and as a local government worker, Parks and Rec, a lot of it is kind of spot on. But yeah, all those workplace comedies or workplace dramas for that matter. We have the Chicago,
Yeah,
you
right.
know, public safety, whatever, and all those things. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I mean, and those always did exist, but yeah, that's what's taken over the kind of main slots. That is so man,
Yeah.
that is wild to think about.
So
Yeah, okay.
another common one, like anytime you read Reddit threads on the internet or wherever, it's so funny. Everybody on social media, or many people, are convinced, and look, there's some reality to this. It's a cost problem. That costs are so outrageous. And look, I get it. I had for my taxes recently, and I had to calculate how much I spent on childcare last year, and it was almost $30,000. You think about
Ooh,
what could you have done with
That's
that
a car.
$30,000. Yeah, I mean, how
Oh
many
my
trips
gosh.
to Europe or to the World
Yeah.
Cup even for $30,000. And so,
Actually, the kind of cars I buy, that would be,
yeah.
5 to 6 cars. So,
Right.
yes, please go
And
on.
that's just childcare,
Yep.
obviously, housing has been another huge rising expense that just feels out of reach. I remember having some friends, 20 years ago, and they're someone whose parents helped them a little bit, didn't buy the whole house, but helped them with the down payment. I remember specifically, I said, "Wow, you were lucky." And she said, "Yeah, but there's a string attached. My parents want my new husband and I to nest. They're buying us the house and expecting the grandkids." And that's exactly what happened. They got the house and a few years later they had the two grandchildren. And so, you can see this big drop off in fertility rates right around the Great Recession in most of these countries we're talking about. Like things had been slowly on the decline, obviously, since the 70s. It's kind of a slow decline, but it's just really downshift sort of in the 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 period. And what's going on then? It's the start of instability for a lot of millennials, housing feeling unaffordable, a lot of student loan, those cost pressures. So economists often dismiss this one, but I don't know. I think that there's a grain of truth to this being part of the conversation of
There
people
was a
feeling that I can't even afford my life. How can I afford a kid?
radical, right-wing firebrand economist, that, named, Elizabeth Warren that wrote a book, maybe 20, 25 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer than that. I don't know actually. The two income trap. Uh, and I do wonder sometimes, we've gained this prosperity sort of nominally by having everybody, not everybody, but so many extra additional people added to the workforce. And I do wonder if that's somewhat of that is I mean, like a lot of things, this is not any one cause. I'm sure it's a multi-factor kind of uh multiple regression and correlation. If I go back to my stats class, yeah, there's different chunks of the Venn diagram that overlap and stuff like that. But yeah.
What's tricky, Joe, is on the one hand, a lot of people celebrate the fact that there's been this massive decline in teenage pregnancy.
Hmm.
Right? And, as a nation, we really tried to address that in the 90s and early 2000s, and we succeeded. Um, but you're right. And a lot of that is because of education, women learning about contraception and getting it, but also women having more opportunities. And we saw the surge in women attending college and at all different levels. And, you're right. It's hard to sort of say, "Oh, you women, you should be dropping out of college and having those babies," when, it's been a huge boost to the economy to have all these highly, educated women coming into the workforce. So yeah, you're right. There's kind of those um, two sides of it. I don't think anybody wants to go back to a world of 16-year-olds having babies, but here's an interesting stat. Here's what's something stunning. So we talk about that fertility rate or that in birth rate of whatever 1.6 kids per child now, or children per woman now. Um, but here's a really stunning stat. And that is another thing to look at is how many women have at least one child by age 45. That has not moved as much as you would think. So if you look at it, in back in 2006 or in the 1980s, only 10% of women reach that kind of 40 to 45 range, that kind of midlife, never having a child. That rate surges to 20% in 2006, so just before the Great Recession hits. But here's what's interesting, in the last few years, it's back down to 15%. We have seen this really interesting trend of millennial women having kids in their, basically in their 40s. That's the one era that's growing, and so it looks like what happened with millennial women is they simply, in many cases, some decided never to have, but a lot of them just delay. And what happens when you delay, and I'm a good example, I gave birth to my first child, my one and only child at age I had just turned 40. I am part of the statistic. And, I originally thought back in my high school and college days, kinda like you were saying, I just assumed that I'd be a mom one day and then I'd probably be a mom of 2 kids because I was raised with this in a 2-kid family and really enjoyed it and just assumed that's what would happen. But then I had to make a very conscious choice. I'm raising a child on my own, things are really expensive. Do I have a second child or not? And for me, that's where the cost factor, the shifting priorities factors, all of these other things really came into play. And ultimately I decided not to have the second child. And that's what's happened to a lot of the reason our fertility rate has fallen. Isn't part of it is that some people are not having kids at all, but a bigger part of it is people are just having fewer kids. It's the one child instead of two, or the two children instead of three.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that part too. I mean, there are obviously always going to be outliers, but well, for example, I went to college with a young woman who's she was from a family of 17 children. So
Wow.
obviously, that's very much the outlier. But so it is it, and this might be too fine grained an analysis, but are we seeing fewer families that have the 5, 6 kids, that sort of
Yes.
thing as well?
Yes.
Okay, so it's across the board.
Yes.
It's not necessarily. I mean, people are having kids. It's just that whole the whole thing is shifted over and down,
Yeah.
basically.
Over and
Oh, that
down.
is
And again,
interesting.
that's where I think, I see it every week on these moms and parent forums that I'm part of on various parts of the internet and Facebook and whatnot, particularly in high cost of living areas. And people are constantly asking, how can, I don't know if I can afford a second child or a third child. Um, that's where a lot of these other pressures start to come in.
That is
Another interesting fact when I was researching and thinking hard about should I have a second child, could we make it work? I look back and when we were young and I was born in the early 1980s, only 1 in 10 children were only children. Today it's 1 in 25, or 25%. It was 10% back in the 80s, and now it's 1 in 4 kids, 25%, who are only children. So you can see that big surge and people deciding to be one and done, as it's
yeah,
called.
yeah.
Um,
Man,
and the
that is
big change is this is where it gets complicated. In the data, at least for millennials and Gen X, if people had a kid by age 30, they were way more likely to have a second or third kid versus if they had their first child in their 30s or obviously in their 40s, huge, huge drop in likelihood of having a second or
I mean,
third.
that makes sense. I mean,
Mhm.
you tend to get a little bit less able to do
Yeah.
it, I mean,
It's hard to
that's
chase after toddlers, I can
yeah,
attest.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I don't know. I still the thing so not to say woe is me, it's people have certain biases about somebody that doesn't have kids and I still really care about children and their future and everything. I just give your child free friends, give them a little break. We really care. I didn't want them for me. It doesn't mean I don't like them. But I am garbage with children though. I am absolutely terrible with them. I tried for years working in education. I never got good at it. My boss's kid said, no, it was like 10 years ago. He said, Joe doesn't have kids, does he? She told me this later.
he called you
She was like,
out, you were called
no,
out,
he
you're
doesn't. And he
typical.
was like, I could tell. I was like, yeah, I don't. I'm not. Yeah, this turns out not the right line of work for me. Anyway, real quick break, plugs and socials. So we are at Moronomics on all the things. Email us at moronomicspod moronomicspod at gmail.com. Um, I saw an everyday economics article or post come through just the other day. So that's my plug on Heather's behalf. I don't really have a plug. I would say I noticed I pulled up an outline from a previous show, and I said be an election judge. Today I got guilted slash convinced to be a chief election judge. So hey, they're really hard up for people in some places. So give that a try. It's a long day, but it's basically one day. And yeah, Heather, did you have anything you wanted to plug or promote or whatever?
Well, I kinda similar and, look for ways to give back to your community. A lot of stuff starts locally, and you're doing the volunteer or the judge, election judge, and I recently joined the finance committee for my HOA, my homeowners
Oh,
association, so I know,
thankless work.
thankless
Absolutely
work, but
thankless.
I
Yes.
sorta thought, yeah, not if
Someone
not
has to do it.
true. Somebody has to do it, and it's time to step up, and we know we're all busy, but, you're right.
So
You
I'm
know,
going to
you
throw a curveball at you that we didn't talk about regarding the birth rate stuff. I saw a thing that says that it's the fault of the smartphones. Everything
I
gets
know,
blamed
that
on the
was gonna be one
smartphones.
of my next ones, yep.
Okay, please. I didn't mean to steal your thunder. So, is that a cause? And should we start just taking people's smartphones and smashing them?
Oh, man, this really just lit up, in the last couple of weeks and the internet. So it all goes back to these same years right around the Great Recession. A lot of people, a lot of countries, including the United States, started to get smartphones. Then they started to really be more widely adopted. And there was a recent research paper that came out that tried to look at. I mean, it's hard to remember back to 2007, but basically, the AT&T, I think it was, got more of the iPhones first and had more people on their network using them than some of the other cell phone networks at the time. Now, of course, everybody caught up pretty fast. But basically, these economists tried to look at areas of the country that had the smartphone first and see if they had lower fertility. And lo and behold, they did. The but here, the big however, is a lot of those places tended to be more urban. And so
Right.
it
I was going
goes
to say you
back
have a
to
covariate in this
yeah, it
situation,
goes
right?
back to the
Yeah.
housing costs and the Sex and the City lifestyle, that we've been talking about, these societal shifts that were going on, alongside these. So it gets a little. I don't think it's nearly as clear cut as some of those headlines were making it. What people like about the smartphone example as a explanation is that it's one of the more global ones. So it helps explain, why is it going down in Asia and Europe
Yeah.
alongside the United States and South Korea, whatever.
Yeah. I
So
was
it is something that you can point to that's used around the world in relatively the same way. Whereas, societal shifts can have some nuances from place to place, or even housing costs. Like, whenever I would bring up some of my arguments for why think the birth rates have fallen, people would say, like, yeah, but, Sweden has really good supports for parents and mothers and really long maternity leave. And they also have a plunging, similar low birth rate, fertility rate to the United States. So the smartphone is attractive for that reason, but I think you still got to give a lot of grain of salt. It's pretty early days.
sure, sure. So one of the aspects of this that I've seen just in passing, by no means an expert on this, is something called a dependency ratio. Is that part of the conversation broadly speaking, or is that like just I ran into some weird corner of the internet and I guess as I understand the dependency ratio thing, it's that as if a society doesn't have the sort of replacement rate childbirth, that eventually you end up with way more older people and not enough young people to kind of care for them or even just productive people funding the care for those older people.
Yeah. So you're getting into should this keep us up at night? When we have politicians who are, I mean, some parts of the world, I know we all pretty familiar with the United States and comments about childless cat ladies and, how whether they contribute to society or not if they don't have kids. But, there are parts of like Eastern Europe, for instance, where they're giving baby bonuses or where they're having, these mass weddings to try to encourage more of their babies and they're sort of champion it as like propaganda campaigns. And, and what they're arguing is just what you're saying that traditionally, when you talk about economic growth, it's the number of people working, you know, plus how productive they are gives you the growth rate, right? And so, we do like if you we go from 100 workers to 13, like we were talking about, can you really continue to grow an economy enough not only to support people who are aging, but also to have any wealth and growth at all? Um, I will say this, as I spent a long time a couple years ago calling around some really smart people to discuss this. And at first I was very worried about it. And I'm look at Social Security and it's gonna start having smaller checks potentially in 6 years, right? This stuff gets real. But the big but is um there were similar fears when baby boomer era was born. How are we gonna support all these people? You know, are we gonna go extinct as a population because we have too many people and, the world can't support all these people? And lo and behold, in the last 80 to 100 years, we had all of these technological advancements that made food production, now you can argue if it's great or agribusiness, but, there's more food production and, better longevity and, we sort of figured out how to handle all these people in the workforce. And I think the opposite will be true. I think there's a solution that will come that may be hard to fully conceive today, but it's not gonna be that, Gen Z women, younger women in their 20s today have to all become trad wives, you know, the traditional wives or whatever who are staying home and having lots of kids and, cooking home cooked meals on the table by 5 every day. We're not going back to the 1950s. Like, there's a solution here, particularly in a world where artificial intelligence may ultimately, hopefully, boost productivity. So that's my more optimistic answer. Is
Well,
there stuff to worry about? Definitely. Is it gonna be tricky? Will we be in a world down the line where maybe we have to tax the robots? Yeah, maybe. Maybe we will, but
yeah,
the
well,
idea that we would sort of, you know, totally run out of money just due to
societal collapse,
yeah,
not
societal
likely.
collapse.
Yeah,
Again,
I
people are smarter than that.
yeah. Well, and as an example of this, I know. I think it was in our high school chemistry class. I don't know that we had that class together, but um, Mr. Brenneman taught us about the Haber process, which is a way to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into ammonia, which then you use as fertilizer, which was a huge, I mean, Nobel Prize winning invention because they were worried that they weren't be able to grow enough food for the entire world's population. The population had been growing and they couldn't get they couldn't grow enough stuff from the soil. And lo and behold, this massive breakthrough comes around that yeah, we can grow more food from the ground because we found a way to get the nitrogen, which is like 70% of what's in the air. We found a way to get that into a solid form that we can then, or liquid, I guess, but that we could then use as fertilizer. So yeah, I tend to think along the lines that you're talking that, yeah, I mean, it might get weird. It's not going to be business as usual, but we are very adaptable. I think, as a species, as a society and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really thinking about it, when you make an argument to dependency ratio, you're basically saying the economy is a Ponzi scheme. Basically, we have to keep, bringing more people in. Yeah, I'm not sure too many people want to go quite to the Ponzi scheme economy. But let me just throw out one more. So I had a chance to interview Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Golden
Well,
a
that's so
year
cool.
or 2 ago, and she wrote a really interesting paper on this that basically boiled down to this is the 5th reason. We talked about costs, we talked about um, changing desires, and we talked about women having more options and contraception, and we talked about cell phones, but the last one is basically, are there no good men? It's basically her argument, which it's not quite how she would say it. I'm way paraphrasing. But her it was a fascinating paper that basically showed that in nations that have a wider gap between how much work around the house and raising kids women do versus men, the fertility rate is even lower. So places like South Korea, women are doing 2 or more hours, like close to 3 hours more of housework than men their husbands are. And in places like the United States, it's still pretty large, although I think it's like 1.8 hours, so it's less than the 2 hours. So there's still a big gap, but basically, women are kinda saying this is a bit of a raw deal for them in particular. Their life changes even more, and that may be part of the calculation. And she also discusses how countries that modernized their economies basically grew really, really fast for a decade or two. And South Korea is a great example, this growth miracle. What happened is men didn't catch up. Men's attitudes stayed very traditional, whereas women suddenly had all this burst of opportunity in the economy. And they were like, "Hey, I don't want to do 3 or 4 extra hours of work compared to you. We're both bringing home a paycheck now." And so, anyway,
Yeah.
um,
What
so it's
a
another
question.
interesting
Sorry.
debate that comes up a lot that I think a lot of people are grappling with.
A question I was thinking about, it kind of complementary to this is uh, earnings gap, and or lack thereof, I guess. And I wonder, I mean, how much of a role that plays in terms of, as we know, women can do it all now, and in terms, particularly in terms of wages, I think that wage gap has been shrinking pretty well, as I understand it, at least. And I wonder if even that's part of it, that whether, yeah, I don't, I'm not putting blame on one party or one gender or the other, but that if a woman's looking around for a husband, she doesn't want a guy who's going to be dead weight, for sure. And if the expectation is on him being, if we're going to have this uneven distribution of housework, well, you better be bringing home, the extra bread. And if there's less and
Yes,
less, of that disparity,
atmosphere.
then, yeah, I'm not formulating what I'm thinking very
No, I
well.
know what you mean, and I
Yeah.
will say in defense of men that, millennial dads, there's been a couple articles in this, are doing way more around the house than their fathers did. And so, they're trying. Millennial dads, I think, are trying. But you're right. There's still a lot of these gaps, and I think it really weighs on these trade-off decisions that so many people are making as they hit, particularly their 30s, and are trying to think, what makes a quote rich, good life. And you're right, the idea that it has to include kids has really changed. The last point I make is, you and I think have covered a lot of the reasons that millennials, our generation, and probably Gen X too, um, didn't have kids. You can sort of pick your favorite one amongst the explanations, but I think it's probably a mix of a lot of them. I think it's really different for Gen Z, and as I wrote an article recently for my college, Wellesley College Alumni Magazine, I interviewed a bunch of, females in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s about this and various experts. And what really stood out to me is this professor who teaches feminist economics, right? And she said, 15 years ago, I would start every class by saying, "Okay, raise your hand if you anticipate and would like to get married." And then she would say, "Raise your hand if you believe you would like to have kids." And she said over half the class, 60, 70% would always raise their hand and say, "Yeah, I plan to have kids." Today, in her most recent semester of teaching this class, less than a quarter of the hands went up for kids. And that's where you see, I think millennials, it was people like you and I, they thought they were going to have kids. And then they either, a few changed their mind, like maybe you, but more were like me and just delayed it. Whereas Gen Z really seems to be something going on where they don't even want it, expect it. Some of these young people, particularly women, are more liberal, even the millennials were, and they think that they don't want to bring a child into this uncertain world. So I don't know. That I think is something to watch, and another conversation and many studies to be done on this sort of shift about young people today around the world.
And this line that you hear a lot of the time, you have a kid that there's like a climate impact or
Mhm.
environmental impact, even
Right.
absent climate aspect. But I have heard people say, "Oh, I don't want to contribute to the problem of diminishing resources or carbon footprint or whatever." And that's an angle that I have heard from a number of young people. Is like, well,
Exactly.
do I want to do that to the world? And it's like, man, that's not in my opinion, that's not, that didn't enter. I mean, I admit fully I was selfish in this regard and that I was thinking of what I wanted, not what would affect the world. Uh, maybe that's a good sign for this generation that they are thinking about the global impact of their decisions. But yeah, I think that is a whole other, that's a whole other topic thing. And yeah, so preview maybe for something to come to our audience, but cool. Well, we're at over 40 minutes now, so I I don't really have any closing thoughts on this drive.
Oh boy, it's been a long day.
So I think a lot of people still do want kids. I think I'm the weirdo in this regard. I think, as you said, if something like 15% of women will have at least a kid by 45, I think that's still probably not to do the oh you'll change your mind later thing. I think a lot of these Zoomers, uh, 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 I think it's probably the case that there's a variety of factors why they're not putting their hand up in class. Um, the sampling method and the social situations.
Yeah.
I think but I think this is something that we could take concrete steps towards. And I look forward to seeing what the world of economics, the sorts of solutions that they come up with. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll just conclude by saying I just wish that there were more shows and again about families. And what worries me a lot is just this absence, growing absence of families, whether it's in our TV or what we're watching on Netflix, or whether it's frankly, there's more and more restaurants and debates about whether airplanes and you should ban kids from business class or ban them from restaurants in certain hours and ban them from church services if they're crying. And so I think that worries me a little bit that you know, I respect everyone's decision to make their own views about having kids or not, but I do worry as society that we're trying to erase kids from more and more spaces. And that to me is a little troubling.
Agreed. Actually, I had a priest tell me, Roman Catholic, um, priest tell me if the church ain't crying, it's dying.
Mm.
Uh, and it, I never give people dirty looks. I give big smiles if somebody has a crying kid because hey, that's the future, So, and next time you see a kid crying in public, just give a smile and give them a thumbs up or something to the parents and say it's okay. I agree. The society will be downstream of culture to a certain extent, and yes, absolutely. So, thank you, Heather. That's a good way to think about this. And thank you for all your insights and everything on the topic. Thank you to our audience for listening, and we'll be talking to you again soon, hopefully. Bye bye.